Welcome to today's webinar of the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership, GARDP. My name is Jennifer Katz, and I'm the Director of External Affairs. I'll be moderating today's webinar with Dr. Manica Balasegaram. The title of the webinar today is How GARDP is Redoubling its Efforts to Accelerate the Development and Delivery of New Treatments. Before I hand over to Dr. Balasegaram, I'm going to tell you a little bit about GARDP and our history and the webinar today. GARDP is an independent legal entity that was initiated by the World Health Organization and the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative in May 2016. GARDP is an important element of WHO's Global Action Plan on Antimicrobial Resistance that calls for new public-private partnerships to encourage research and development of new antimicrobial agents and diagnostics. GARDP benefits from its unique parentage, drawing strength from both WHO's mandate to drive the global response to AMR and set health priorities, and DNTI's expertise in harnessing partnerships to build a pipeline for neglected diseases and deliver not-for-profit, needs-driven R&D. As I mentioned, GARDP is now an independent entity with a 3-year track record. Building on that successful track record, GARDP is now committing to redouble its efforts, and today we are announcing an ambitious goal to deliver 5 new treatments by 2025. The full strategy behind this goal will be launched at the World Health Summit in October in Berlin. Before I hand over to Dr. Manica Balasegaram, I'll tell you a little bit about him and also review how you can ask questions during this webinar. Dr. Balasegaram is a medical doctor by training. He has significant experience working in humanitarian organizations and conducting and overseeing clinical trials, as well as in policy advocacy and access to medicines. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the webinar today and to give you Dr. Balasegaram. If you want to submit questions during the session today, you can submit your questions at any time through the questions window within your presentation screen. At the end of this session, we will do a Q&A. Thank you.
So thank you everybody for joining us today for this webinar. I will present a short summary of the new GodP business strategy. This strategy has been discussed with the board of directors of GodP fairly recently, just in our last board meeting this month, and has been approved by our board of directors. However, the full business plan will be launched in October during the World Health Summit. So what you will really see here is a top-level perspective of the strategy, and obviously one of the reasons why we're doing this webinar is to also get some input from you in the external environment. So we very much welcome your questions as well. I will start with a very general slide, really identifying why antimicrobial resistance is a global issue and currently is a global crisis. And we believe it is a threat to public health, and has been noted it is also a threat to Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, and is widely seen as a risk in achieving universal health coverage, as well as a health security issue in its own right. But of course, the impact of AMR goes beyond health. There's direct impact on poverty, on trade, obviously on healthcare costs, but also on livestock output, considering the One Health dimension of antimicrobial resistance. And what you can see in this slide is really all the different areas, for instance, where antimicrobial resistance will impact on the Sustainable Development Goals. I think for all of us in this audience, it's very important that we emphasize these, I would say, cross-sectoral impact of what is becoming a very important issue. Of course, when we then look in a more narrow perspective in the research and development landscape, and particularly when we talk about research and development for new therapeutics, there are several aspects that have really led to our current situation where we see a highly unfavorable environment, and I'm saying that as an understatement. And in fact, that is actually due to multiple factors. On the one hand, we have growing public health needs, And in fact, we have multiple indications, needs, and populations that we have to address. We have very clear access gaps when we talk about old and new antibiotics. We have a fragile pipeline, and that really is to a very large degree due to the market failures there. And of course, there is an issue around financing, both for research and development and for access and sustainable use. So all of these factors are really contributing to a very complex picture. And unfortunately, it's a reason why organizations like GodP do need to exist. Just a little bit about us, GodP facts and figures. We are, as Jennifer mentioned, an independent foundation. We are actually registered in Switzerland, and we are currently in the process of seeking international organization status. We have been co-founded by the World Health Organization as part of their Global Action Plan and the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. And we have now set up a scientific advisory board and a board of directors as part of the governance structures. GodP has already started operational activities. So just looking at least on the research and development side, we are, of course, working on a first-in-class antibiotic that's now entering phase 3. We have 4 recovered antibiotics in different phases of development. We have several new chemical entities that we are now under discussions with potential biotech companies. We have started some very small early stage R&D activities. So we are currently screening 4 libraries for antibiotic activity. And we have actually to date completed 3 clinical studies, clinical trials. So we are in the process of actually continuing to fundraise for our current and future activities, and to say we are largely a government-funded organization at present. And as you can see in the photo, there is now actually a team behind GodP, as well as a very wide network of partners that also are significantly important in executing the operations of GodP. So GodP does, for us, does represent a very unique approach in addressing AMR and trying to address this issue of the R&D pipeline and really the failures that we're seeing in how and how I think different sectors can accelerate the development of new therapeutics. From our perspective, GodP takes a very strong public health R&D perspective. We are therefore here to address global health priorities, incorporating the needs also of developing countries as well as developed countries. Our principle is that we work from any entry point, but wherever we start, we go all the way through registration and into access. And any given one of our projects, we are engaging with multiple different actors in a collaborative approach. We are also here to target important indications that are less likely to be developed by other actors, and also ensure that new antibiotics developed are affordable and available in high burden countries. And I think it's through this that we feel that we can best address the issue around the SDGs and also help to meet the WHO to meet the Global Action Plan against AMR. We have now, as part of our new business strategy, formulated a new vision and mission, which is presented here on the slides. All infections are treatable for everyone, everywhere. Really our mission is to bring together the public and private sectors to develop and deliver new treatments for bacterial infections, addressing the public health impact of antibiotic resistance. So really, this is really to emphasize that we are here to develop and to deliver. We are going to focus likely on late stage R&D going into access. Our modus operandi is to work with bring together the public and the private sector, considering that a lot of the innovation is largely in the private sector, and that we believe in developing strong, equitable partnerships, particularly with the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries. So this is really a kind of overview or snapshot of GodP. And of course, within our partnerships, beyond our private sector partners, we are incorporating academia, civil society, governments, and of course, our funders. Of course, as I mentioned, WHO has been very instrumental in helping to set up GodP. We have a very close collaboration with the World Health Organization. WHO plays an extremely important role in the response, global response against antimicrobial resistance. They are part of the tripartite. And of course, many of you may be familiar with the interagency coordination group that has come up with very clear recommendations, and WHO is really playing an important role there. WHO is really working to do the priority setting, provide technical input. It convenes international experts and meetings for us. It is there to provide the global development and stewardship framework, particularly around access. It has helped GodP to mobilize political support of member states. And it's really helped to bring in GodP, and not just GodP, but AMR in general, into the G20, G7, and other international fora. And of course, on a day-to-day basis, we are interacting with multiple departments within WHO. Of course, the newly created AMR division, which is led by the new Assistant Director General, Dr. Hanan Balki, the disease departments, such as the Sexual Reproductive Health Department, and of course, the essential medicines programs that plays a very important role in health policy and access. And of course, we also work with the regional and country offices of WHO. So our new business strategy is really framed around our commitment of what we can deliver between 2020 and 2025. So we have launched a new 5x25 strategy where we are committed to develop and deliver 5 new treatments to address antibiotic-resistant infections by 2025. And to give you an example, what kind of treatments are we aiming to develop? Of course, they will be based on the WHO priority pathogen list. So they could include, for instance, treatments for carbapenem-resistant Cyanobacter infections or carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae infections. But also we are looking at specific diseases and indications as well. So this will include sexually transmitted infections. And of course, we are focusing also not just on adult populations, but also on children and pediatric and neonatal populations. So we are trying to take a kind of 3-lens approach with the pathogens, the populations, and of course, specific indications as well. And we will be focused on developing assets in late-stage clinical development and working on accelerating their access as well. Now, obviously, to achieve this, even if we are relying on other entities and other organizations and funders who will be providing and funding a lot of these projects as well as funding from the private sector, we still believe we need significant financial resources to achieve this 5x25 goal. So we are really calling to raise 500 million to accelerate the development and delivery of these 5 new treatments by 2025, and we have already started an active engagement to achieve this objective. So a little bit about how GodP works. We have our vision and mission, and within our mission, we have the different strategic pillars of GodP. And we have 4 strategic pillars that we have developed as part of our new business strategy. But in fact, to be honest, this is already, I would say, the current modus operandi of GodP. So probably the more well-known pillar is what we do around research and development, where we are addressing global health needs. In the R&D pillar, we have both some in-house expertise as well as a network of partners and service providers who work closely with us as well. We focus on clinical and pharmaceutical development, and we will work both on regulatory and public health trials and work towards label expansion as well as evidence generation for optimum implementation. And of course, this will mean that we will require significant resources because the downstream part is really where one needs significant resources to conduct these activities. We will also maintain a small number of projects in the discovery and exploratory phase. And of course, we aim to work very closely with other initiatives such as CARB-X, because ultimately we are here to also work in taking forward I think promising candidates coming out of the CARB-X pipeline as well. The second pillar is based around our portfolio management, and in a way, this is really trying to ensure that we can coordinate and move forward key drugs of public health value within what we call a public health portfolio. So within this portfolio, we are committed to build, invest, and co-develop with our private sector partners. We are willing to provide both in-kind and direct contributions to them in return for contractual returns around access, of which I will mention more of that later. And of course, what we're trying to ensure is that we have the freedom and rights to develop for public health indications, as well as register and deliver these tools in high burden countries and specific target populations. The third pillar is key because we are a partnership and we work through a partnership model. So this pillar is really concerning partnerships and networks, and they are really all the multiple different entities that we have already got together with and that we hope to also partner in the future to help us really deliver on our mission. So within us as the GodP team, we want to stay as a fairly lean team, and what we really intend to do is work directly in collaboration and partnerships with a range of different actors to help us execute our mission. And through doing this, we also hope to therefore continue to enrich the R&D ecosystem in the AMR drug development space. We hope to strengthen clinical trial networks incorporating high burden countries, for instance, and we also want to build these strategic partnerships that are going to be directly involved in accelerating and delivering on R&D programs. And a key part of what we will do is really bring together the public and private sector in our partnership model. And the last pillar, last but not least, is really around sustainable access. This will, of course, be focused on our portfolio of drugs that we have, but there are different things that we are intending to look at, such as how can we accelerate a global regulatory approach and ensure access in a wide range of countries. And some of you may be familiar of a recent publication that showed that, in fact, due to a variety of different factors, many of the new antibiotics that were coming onto the market were registered in a very small number of countries. We also intend to work on how we can look at things like cost of goods and streamlining manufacturing and really ensuring that we have a sustainable supply, really linking with third parties, including antibiotic manufacturers and generic companies. The third aspect is around reimbursement models and linked to that also procurement strategies. We feel both aspects are very important to address. I think if we don't look at reimbursement, we are going to run into significant problems around the long-term sustainable access of these antibiotics. And I think this is very much fitting into also WHO's own strategy around fair pricing. So it is something that we will need to look at for the portfolio of drugs that we are working at, and we are committed to work with our private sector partners as well as governments on this. I think in procurement, there's much that has been done in the global health space. We feel there are some opportunities to really look at how procurement can be approached to really ensure that, for instance, we can look at much more predictable demand, we can accelerate access, and we can also ensure that the approach on how antibiotics are introduced and how sales are approached are different. So I think we do feel that we do need to look at and engage with other global health actors and see how we can advocate for others to be involved and potentially do interventions both for potentially a small number of old and new antibiotics, and particularly also to focus on procurement for high burden countries. When we look at policy and guidelines, for us, we feel this is absolutely essential to not just ensure access, but appropriate use and therefore stewardship. So GodP is committed towards engaging to both directly and indirectly support studies and evidence generation that will inform and guide policy and use. And this is often an overlooked piece, particularly post-registration, but can be important in better determining the use of a new antibiotic that's coming onto the market. And last and not least, obviously, we are going to be looking at how we can support in and out licensing strategies. And this is absolutely critical to look at sustainable manufacturing and supply of antibiotics in different regions of the world. And then cutting across that is the work we're going to do around financing, and of course what we have to do as an organization to develop to ensure we can deliver on these strategic pillars, as well as having the transparent and open governance that will make us, a trustable partner to engage in both the public and private sector. And this slide really goes into a little bit more granularity on the previous slide. Looking at how we bridge this gap between R&D and access, and looking at how we utilize the partnership model to do this. Starting at the bottom, we are targeting public health needs. And through that, once we have done that, including with other actors such as WHO, we start to build a public health portfolio and then conduct or finance R&D programs through direct or in-kind investments, and secure affordable access through negotiated partnerships. Then work through the process with our partners and work through that through registration and facilitating policy guidelines, use, out-licensing strategies, and how we can then support rollout of new treatments. And to do this, we will leverage both the public and private R&D ecosystem, there's a range of different actors that may be involved in any specific individual project that we are engaged in, with the objective of ultimately accelerating access to all in need. Practically speaking, what does our operations look like? Obviously, we have a small number of discovery and exploratory exploratory work, and in the middle piece, it's really about asset evaluation. So what are the key assets out there that we can identify and then engage in a significant manner in the clinical development stage? And I will really say clinical and pharmaceutical development, because we are also actively engaging with partners on, for instance, CMC and pharmaceutical development. We have 4 programs for the late stage development, such as the first program is on sexually transmitted infections. The second and third is on neonatal sepsis, and also on accelerating the development of pediatric antibiotics, particularly new chemical entities in the pipeline, how we can accelerate the pediatric studies and pediatric indications. And lastly, this is a new program that we will be commencing in our new business plan, a program on adult serious gram-negative bacterial infections. So here we will be engaging with companies to really see how we can support them in their late-stage clinical development to facilitate registration, but also beyond that, how we can expand indications, how we can also do the additional public health trials that will be critical for policy guidelines, use, and ultimately also things like reimbursement. So I think, you know, there's a lot of technical aspects that one has to cover here, and we obviously will need to carefully choose and build our portfolio to deliver on these programs. And cutting across our R&D programs are the scientific affairs, including the Revive project that is really extremely important in helping us do our outreach to provide education, knowledge sharing. So what does building successful partnerships with the private sector look like? This slide is really a very top level slide, and I would like to make it very clear that no, we don't have a cut and paste agreement with companies, and even within a company we may have different agreements for different drug development projects. But broadly speaking, we are willing to provide R&D sponsorship, including what we can, taking on sponsorship of clinical trials and also on CMC development, and also provide our in-house expertise, so providing that as also as an in-kind support. We also provide access to the GodP network, including a network we are starting to really support in high burden countries, and then also engage in post-regulatory activities, as I mentioned, such as phase 4 trials. And I think importantly, we can provide this R&D sponsorship and fund all of the trials, but we can also provide upfront funding for specific entities who are already engaged in sponsoring their own activities. But of course, this will have to be carefully crafted and have to be milestone driven. And so this is really going to depend on a company by company basis, on a project by project basis. It will depend on what you in the companies have in terms of your own in-house expertise, your own infrastructure, your own resources, who else you're partnering with, who are your service providers, what commitments you've already made to other investors. And on the flip side of the coin, you know, where are your gaps? And so we will tailor make an agreement to best fit that scenario. Of course, we will have requests on our side, so we will need to have some oversight on what you are doing. This could be set up through things like joint steering committees, for instance, and through reporting mechanisms. We will need to obviously agree on a common R&D and access strategy. That's a given, because we see ourselves as a partner, and so we need to clearly elucidate what are realistic and achievable stewardship and access commitments that we can make. We can also look at exclusive licenses in priority countries, particularly high burden developing countries as an example of that, where we know that marketing the product may be a struggle for certain companies. So this is something that we are willing to take on. And we will, of course, discuss things like royalties on sales to support access in these high burden settings as well. So we, as ourselves, are also committed to trying and finding, multiple and sustainable financing mechanisms for our programs and projects. And of course, we do have to ensure affordability globally, but also, of course, for developing countries, this will be an issue. And I, of course, very much regret that we have to put in this last issue, but we do indeed have to think about how in the deal structure we will deal with things like bankruptcy and change of control as well. So these are things that I think we can manage, we can do, and we are already engaging with a few private sector entities to discuss this. So this is not set in stone. This is going to be tailor-made. We are realistic on what we ask, because it will be tied to what we put in. So clearly, the more we put in, the more we will ask back. But I think for all of you who are working in this space, this is a very reasonable approach. So then going to the next slide, which really talks about the collaborative partnership model. As you can see, there are many different sectors one has to engage in, even on an individual drug development project. This can provide some complexity in terms of managing all these relationships, and this is something in GodP that we have experience as individuals doing. But we feel this kind of complex relationships are, of course, essential in approaching drug development from an international perspective and trying to address global health needs. And we will work largely as a virtual organization through these partnerships, and really will seek to ensure multi-stakeholder collaborations where they are relevant. We can be involved in actively driving programs, and in other areas where that's less appropriate because of the resources of the entity we're partnering with. This can be more funding, direction, and support. And of course, we have in-house capabilities as well as a network of experts and partners that will be involved in our R&D programs. So what does access look like to us? There are different aspects that we are starting to look at in access, ranging from procurement to reimbursement to outsourcing strategies, policy use, regulatory licensing. But we are not necessarily going to be fully involved in all these different spaces. There can be light levels of engagement on one side to heavy levels of engagement. And we may advocate or facilitate or implement or do all three. And so that will probably be based more on the individual program, project, and partnership we form. But clearly, we feel that we will probably be more involved on things like working on CMC, cost of goods, on the networking and partnership building, on policy use, on expanding global registration, and where relevant on supporting in and out licensing as well. And there are other areas where we will need to play a supportive role and or facilitatory role. And I would emphasize that, of course, we are also engaged with WHO, who are really involved in policy making. So our role is to generate the evidence. WHO's role is to set policy and guidelines. So just to ensure that there's no confusion between those two aspects. So I will stop there, and I'll be very happy to take questions now. Please do submit your questions.
Thanks very much, Manica. We have some questions coming in. So Could you tell us a little bit more about how you prioritize the treatments that you'll work on? So clearly you talked about some of the priority areas in the discussion, but could you say more about that?
Thank you for the question. I think that's a very fundamental question. The prioritization is really done on a very fundamental level in terms of what is the organization's focus. So we are focused on bacterial infections. We are focused on gram-negatives, and we will prioritize projects that are obviously focusing on gram-negative infections. We are looking at both adults and pediatrics, and of course, we will look at also sexually transmitted infections. Now, for an individual project, for instance, to give you an example on how we prioritize on sexually transmitted infections, we've worked very closely with WHO to develop target product profiles. And then we have really, WHO, as you know, have done a pipeline review, and we're really looking at the candidates in that pipeline review to find which fits the scope of our work and which will fit on the current target product profiles that we have developed and future ones that WHO are also now in the process of developing. There is a governance process within GodP. So we have a scientific advisory committee, and all potential candidates are put forward into our scientific committee to be reviewed from a scientific perspective. But of course, there is also the components around access and the deal framework. So that is also a very important part where we have to engage, and we will be having a dedicated piece of the governance of GodP to review that. I would also say that, of course, what we don't do is put out open calls. We have the pipeline, and we're utilizing the pipeline to now actively identify late-stage projects that we feel are promising. And then what we are doing is simply engaging in outreach with those relevant companies and having bilateral discussions with them. And if we feel those discussions are advanced enough, we can then present, obviously, all the necessary due diligence, and of course present the deal structure to our board of directors, who will provide the final approval.
Thanks very much. We had a specific question relative to including serious gram-positive infections. Is that something you can just comment briefly on related to your first response?
Yes, that is indeed a good question, considering that some of the populations we're trying to target. A very good example of that is neonatal sepsis, for instance, where you often have to treat without knowing the underlying pathology, and one has to look at both gram-positive and gram-negative infections and coverage for that. So for certain cases, we will be willing to look at where we feel we do need to support the development of a gram-positive drugs, but it's really going to be contextualized in that kind of scenario. However, in terms of a new chemical entity passing through the pipeline, we are going to prioritize on the gram-negatives, and this has clearly been obviously a priority that has been set by WHO in their priority pathogen list. Now, maybe that will change, and when that does, we will obviously internally review our prioritization framework.
Thanks, Manica. We had another question related to prioritization, which has to do with work in diagnostics. Is that something you can comment on? I'm trying to kind of group the questions to try to be a little bit helpful here.
So that is indeed an important aspect of what we're looking at. In GodP, we do have to focus, although the charter of the organization gives us a relatively broad scope to cover drugs, therapeutics, to look at diagnostics and infection prevention control, as an example. We as an organization starting now have to be focused. And so we are going to focus on therapeutics. But having said that, what we are doing is developing partnerships with other actors who can then facilitate the development of diagnostics. There's clearly work being done by entities such as Carbex, for instance, that are supporting diagnostic development. So we do not need to duplicate the work that they do. And then more on the downstream side as well, we have already partnered with the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics. and they will be our committed partner to support the parallel development of diagnostics for relevant indications, and particularly also for drugs that we are developing where we do need to look at diagnostics. So to give an example of that, we are engaged in a drug development project for a first-in-class drug for sexually transmitted infections. And in this project, we do have to look at the diagnostic components. So FIND is actually working as in one of their priorities on accelerating the development for sexually transmitted infections, including gonorrhea. So we have formulated a direct collaboration with them. FIND is actually receiving funding from this, from some donors, and we work together and collaborate together on this. And to actually give an example of how that collaboration works, we have actually started off by developing with FIND in the driving seat and with WHO, sorry, in the driving seat, developing target product profiles for what a diagnostic would look like, and FIND has now put out a call for this. So that's an example of how we will work together in the diagnostic space. This will be replicated in other areas in the future.
Shifting gears, we've had a couple of questions about working with GARDP at an individual level. So I might just go ahead and answer that one, which is to say that we do have some positions that we are looking for, and you can find those on our website and also on our LinkedIn page. And if you do have a question about working with us in that individual capacity, please do feel free to contact us through those sites, and we can respond to your queries there. Shifting gears a little bit, we've had quite a number of questions coming in around access. So I will do my best to group these a little bit as well and frame those up for you. In regard to the policy guidelines aspect of the work that you were talking about on the access slide, in the absence of a WHO framework, can you comment on your thoughts of how to establish some international consensus about appropriate use around this chain, if you will?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Before I answer that, I will just say that in terms of working with GodP, we're very keen to also develop partnerships with institutions, and through those institutions work with individuals who are interested to engage in our work. But also we are also open to the idea potentially of secondments as well. So that's something just to add. The question around policy guidelines and use, I think, is a very, very important issue, and one that deserves far more attention than it currently gets. Having said that, and we as GodP have had quite a lot of discussions with WHO on this, this is a train that is now moving. WHO have already started on 3 different levels. They have they have an ongoing essential medicines list, and are now reviewing antibiotics within the essential medicines list, both old and new antibiotics. They have an antibiotic working group that is now dedicated towards this. Secondly, they have developed the AWARE categorization, access, watch, and reserve. And this is actually now functioning, and they are placing antibiotics and classes of antibiotics into these different categories. And this is there to provide support to countries in terms of how these drugs will be used and should be made accessible. But more importantly, it will provide a monitoring framework as well. And thirdly, last but not least, WHO is planning to develop, well, I should say that potentially develop, because this is something that's still a work in progress, but certainly I would say a handbook for antibiotic use. So WHO had already partly done this in a previous essential medicines list, where they had looked at 22 odd bacterial indications or syndromes and made some recommendations, doing it through a review of existing evidence. But in fact, I think what WHO is now looking at is doing this in a more thorough way, in a more detailed way. And of course, some of you may have already seen exactly the kind of thing that has been done by NICE, where you have very clear guidelines for use in different indications or syndromes for key antibiotics. But of course, what we now need to do and pick up the challenge on is to see, well, how are we going to approach this for a new antibiotic? how are we going to best place a new antibiotic coming through the pipeline into either access, watch, or reserve list? How can we accelerate the development for key indications so that we can facilitate moving these drugs into an appropriate place of use? And so I think this is going to be very important, because this will help to determine the use of the drug, and actually in a way will help to determine where this drug should be placed in healthcare systems.
Staying on the access theme, a challenging question, but could you comment a little bit on how you see working with downstream partners, or how there might be opportunities to incentivize manufacturers when you are looking at a watch or reserve situation for a new antibiotic or even an old antibiotic?
Yes, I think that's a good question, and I think that I think one has to look at different reimbursement structures for these watch or reserve antibiotics, because it is absolutely essential to ensure a sustainable supply of these antibiotics, and obviously having some rational demand and procurement for these antibiotics may also help as well. And of course, it's important to remember that these antibiotics may change. Some antibiotics may be placed on the reserve situation, but we may feel that perhaps there are more access antibiotics in the future, as the epidemiological situation shifts or change. Or perhaps they can be given for a specific population, such as in pediatrics, or for instance in neonates. They should be really placed in a higher categorization. So I think, or in a different categorization, I should say. So I think while I don't have an immediate answer of saying it should cost this much, or we use this type of incentive mechanism, I absolutely do think that this is how we need to link the discussion around access and reimbursement, link these two issues of access and reimbursement together, and really talk about it being a driver to ensure sustainable access and appropriate use. Because I think if this doesn't happen, then indeed the risk is that we will see antibiotics just disappear if they're not basically placed in a prime time position, bearing in mind that prime time may be at a slightly later date. So it's all the more important to secure, I would say, the future of this antibiotic.
All right, let's go with one more question, staying on the kind of access framework slide. We had a specific question, just if you could say more about cost of goods focus under the outsourcing strategies. What do we mean there? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so we indeed understand that cost of goods are important everywhere, I think. If you look at the economics of antibiotic development, this isn't great. And I think there are two reasons why we want to decrease the cost of goods, both ultimately for efficiency. But on the one hand, this will be advantageous to countries, because lower cost of goods could mean lower price of the antibiotic, particularly if we're looking at a more marginal profit margin in developing countries. And there, I think the flip side of the coin, for a manufacturer, and particularly also a licensee of a new antibiotic, where we are not seeing a favorable economic climate, that will make an impact, I think, on the return to that company. So working on the cost of goods is important. What we will do is directly invest in the pharmaceutical development to make the synthesis production of the antibiotic as efficient as we possibly can. That's a starting point, and we're already doing that for one of our drug development projects, where we're trying to significantly lower the cost of goods of the drug. But of course, as the second part will be depending on things like volume, and that's where developing rational guidelines and working on other aspects of access will have an impact. But I do think that even on the R&D stage, we are already committed and investing in this area, and it's not cheap.
Switching around again to some questions about partnerships. And so we've had several questions in here about at which stages would we partner, what that might look like, and how would folks get in touch with us about that, which I think comes back to the discussion we had about prioritization. But maybe if you could give a kind of general answer about where we work on the pipeline, and how folks can get in touch with us to partner. So going back to looking at where our prioritization is, where our priorities are, and then what stages of development
Yeah.
we look for projects.
So I have gone through, I think, what is our focus and kind of programmatic priorities. But I just want to repeat and emphasize that, we are open to engage directly with individual entities and companies. And often I think, one thing to remember is that these discussions often take time. So we do realize we're not necessarily an easy organization to understand in terms of how we are working in these deal structures, and these kind of deals can take quite a long time to negotiate. So we would invite entities and companies to engage with us as early as possible to start discussions, because often that discussion will take time. We will need to find the right way to develop a partnership and then move things forward. But by and large, as I say, we are planning to put the large majority of our investments into phase 2, phase 3, and post-regulatory activities. And so we're really now looking to identify candidates that are now gone through preclinical, have got their IND, are going to commence phase 1. This would be a good time for us to start a dialogue.
Great, thank you. On a different track, we have questions about whether or not we're contemplating workshops to further stimulate R&D.
So absolutely, and I think to give you an example of that, we are already organizing a workshop next week, next Monday and Tuesday, on access, and we are broken down onto those different pieces that I've already presented. But we will of course be very happy to engage and to have further discussions on specific technical aspects of R&D. So this is clearly in the pipeline for us. This is certainly something that if there are suggestions out there, we'd be very happy to hear and take ideas and partner with others to convene such workshops. And of course, I would also say through the Revive program, we have been conducting webinars and workshops. We have done this with other partners as well. We are targeting conferences such as ECMID and ASM, where we are doing this. So this is already ongoing. We're already doing some of this work in an ongoing basis.
A couple of questions around working with government. So we have two different types of questions. So the first one is around, how do you see working with governments on policy change and ultimately policy making regarding AMR?
So there are two parts of what we would need to work in. First, obviously, we are engaging with WHO. Because at an international level, WHO is clearly the organization that has the mandate from all the member states to work on this issue. And so we engage directly with WHO on this. However, individual member states have also been interested to engage with us, and we are interested to engage, of course, with key member states. And at the end of the day, it will be individual member states who will decide what they will do regarding things like procurement, regarding things like reimbursement, regarding things like policy guidelines and use. Although clearly, I think what happens in the international forum can play a lot of influence on what governments may subsequently decide to do. So our role is really there to help facilitate the discussion. And I think the advantage of what we can do is we can bring individual projects onto the table and utilize that as a way of having a meaningful and concrete discussion. And I think one of the struggles we've had in the past in the policy space is that too much of the discussions around solutions has been conceptual. And I think what we will offer to do is to really base this on a case-by-case basis, provided we are willing. We have willing governments, and we have the mandate from our private sector partners to engage on some of these issues on different aspects. We are willing to facilitate and to engage these discussions and move them forward and move them in a concrete way. So this is certainly something that we feel we want to have in a major part of our business plan. However, this is now has to be done in a transparent way, And this is the reason why we are now very carefully thinking about the evolution of the governance of GodP to ensure that we have the right governance that can ensure good transparency in how this works.
So the second question around collaboration with governments is about how can a government get in touch with us if they are interested in helping to fund the 500 million goal and target that you have put out today. So I'll give, there's on our website a general contact email, which is contact@gardp.org. But that is, of course, a question near and dear to my heart as Director of External Affairs. And you should also feel free to reach out to me directly in that situation. And our information can be found on the GARDP website. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, and I would add that we are really looking for partnerships with governments that it's not just based around the funding. The funding is going to be the absolutely critical piece for us, but through this we want to expand the relationship to ensure that we can bring governments on board to really also be part of GodP and in part of the evolving governance of GodP. As well as also helping to build country level collaborations as well. And that's, we have different models of how we engage with different governments on this. And so, for instance, we can often engage directly and are engaging directly with research, national research institutions or research bodies of certain governments that allowing us to work on certain aspects such as how to foster and accelerate the development of clinical trial sites and so on and so forth. So we are interested to hear from all governments, and there's many different forms of engagement. And of course, we are definitely looking for funding from governments, large and small.
Great, thank you. A lot of good questions here. I think we just have time for a couple more, and then we'll wrap up the webinar today. So really appreciate all the engagement and the questions that we've had from folks. A few questions I'm going to try to group together here, which again gets back to how we partner, particularly I think with private sector entities. So you had mentioned some types of partnerships and some ways of involvement, I guess, of the different parties. So through potentially a joint project committee or a joint development program. So could you say a little bit more about that team structure and then what the different parties might bring to that? I think the key here for us, as you'll describe, is that we're bringing complementary things to the table within this.
So, the idea is indeed to bring what you don't have necessarily, and not what you have and do well. And of course, this will really also depend on the size of the company. Could be a small company, could be a medium-sized company, could be a larger company. And of course, there's some companies, some of which we've already signed partnerships with, who are actually in a position to offer us something. So I think that's something that really has to be borne in mind. Some companies do have built up expertise in certain areas, and we're extremely interested to hear from such companies who would be willing to engage with us on this. But in a typical deal framework, we will bring in financial resources, we will bring in obviously our internal R&D team, but we will also bring in networks and partnerships. And this could include, for instance, to give you a very concrete example, this could include a partner who's engaged in a trial network, for instance. And I think that certainly a different aspect may be on the pharmaceutical development, for instance. So I think it really will depend on what you need. If it's something that you have in-house, that it's already funded, you have good expertise or good partners or good CROs who are doing this, then clearly what we will look for is really to see what else we would offer that you don't have. And sometimes it's clearly the case where we feel that maybe you don't need our support, that's fine, but we maybe facilitate indirectly other aspects which may be useful to you. So everything is open for discussion. By and large, with the companies we've discussed, companies are requesting both direct and indirect support. And this obviously is not small. The requests are coming in the multi-million level over several years. And it's understandable, because if you look at the costs of drug development, this is not insignificant. And then if you look at the fact that companies now have to think going beyond just one regulatory or two regulatory trials, but have to look at how they will also expand indication to the pediatric development, and now have to start thinking about what we discussed earlier on policy guidance and use. So there's clearly a lot there on the table that has to be looked at, and we are willing to look at all these different components.
Thanks very much. We have a couple of questions about some very technical aspects of the areas that we're focusing on, and particularly some information about neonatal sepsis. So I would encourage those viewers and listeners to go onto the website, look under our R&D activities, and there are fact sheets around the different programs with some information about burden and things that have been posed in the questions. So I will not ask Manica to answer another specific question on that, but rather encourage you to surf around a little bit on the site to find some of that information. And certainly if you don't find what you're looking for, feel free to contact us through that address. So I think we have addressed most of the questions here in the different groupings, and being mindful of time, I think we would just like to end the webinar by number one, thanking all of you for your questions. If you feel that something hasn't been addressed, again, do feel free to contact us through this. And also, you can see some of the workshops and things that Manica talked about on our Revive website and platform, where there are some technical expertise and networks being provided there as well. And lastly, I will just hand over to Manica to close the webinar.
So thank you very much to all of you coming from different parts of the world to join us on this webinar. We look forward to engaging with many of you in the future. I also like to thank you thank you to all our funders and supporters and partners who are really a fundamental part of the GodP partnership. So thank you very much, and have a good day to all of you.